In today's video, we're going to take a look at the brand new background assets framework from Apple. Before we jump into things, drop a like down below, hit subscribe if you're new here, and let's talk about this brand new framework. So first and foremost, what the heck is this and what does it let you do? So it's a little self-explanatory. It lets you download any large assets, and truthfully, it doesn't even have to be large, but something from a remote URL when your app downloads for the first time or updates in the background. So this is kind of a big deal because historically, Apple's own guidelines have said, hey, don't use external stuff after your app has been approved. But this framework specifically lets you kind of circumvent that. And of course, they have a scary warning here saying, hey, don't abuse this, don't use it to track people, etc., etc. But in my own usage so far, it isn't really that limiting. You can basically download and schedule stuff in a variety of ways. Now, before we jump into Xcode, why would you want to use this? Well, there's two reasons. One, you don't need to bundle your actual assets, be them images, audio, whatever you might use, in your apps. Your initial download size is pretty small in the App Store. That means people can download it without being on Wi-Fi, aka cellular. And two, you can remotely update assets. So you can imagine in like a game, that's the example that Apple uses. If you have a background, it's your character images, and you want to update them, you can do that remotely without having to submit an update to the App Store. So that's enough talking. Let's jump into Xcode. By now, you should have smashed that like button. We're going to create a new project. I'll caveat that this is Xcode 14.1 release candidate. The APIs for background assets are only available in 16.1, so just make sure you're in the proper Xcode version. We'll create a iOS app here, and let's go ahead and call this cool background assets, and we're going to want to stick with storyboard in this case, doesn't really matter, and Swift for our language. I'll create it on my desktop and just full screen this guy here. Whoops, that's not how we full screen. There we are. And the first thing that we actually need to do is do a bit of setup. So similar to a lot of the capabilities that are enabled every WWDC, there are some Info.plist keys that we all know and love that we need to add. So the first thing I'm going to have everyone do is make sure that your deployment target is set to 16.1, so right here in the center, it is defaulted to that. And then we're going to jump to the info section either here or what I like to particularly do on the left-hand side, right-click info, and then we're going to do open as source code. And we want to add a couple of keys inside here, and that's what this other tab is that I've got open. So there are actually three, or I should say 4 or 5 keys to add. And the first one is this BA initial download restrictions, which is of type dictionary. So I'm literally going to copy and paste from here. And essentially, this is Apple trying to safeguard lack of abuse of this thing. So let's see, where we want to put this is, so we have our, let me just go into here. Let's open this up as a property list. Let's see if I can do this correctly without breaking anything. So here we have a property list. I'm just going to throw a test in here. And we're going to go and update that. I just want to make sure I'm putting it at the correct indentation. So here is a key. We'll just toss this in. This is a dictionary as the documentation mentioned. So let's make this a dictionary. Now, subsequently, this has more keys inside of it, the first one being a download allowance. Now, this is a integer in bytes, basically. What is the download allowance for your application's assets that will be downloaded? And we're going to toss this in here. Let's make a key, if I can make brackets properly. There we are. And that'll be a key as well. We'll toss that in there. And I mentioned it's an integer, so we will copy and paste that, update this to be an integer, and generally 3.1 billion is, I believe, 3 bytes. So we're going to do 3 billion, 100 million, 100,000, 100. And we are going to want one more thing in here, and the next thing is going to be a type of a string, and this is going to be the actual, whoops, that's not a string, the actual URL that we want to be downloading from. So if we go to this next one here, we're basically going to be whitelisting domains that we can download from. This key is BA download domain allow list. So we'll copy and paste that key right there. Let me fix that. Whoops, I actually think I did the wrong one there. Let me actually make sure we're doing the right one here. So we're going to go down here and do that one. And let's go ahead and give this an update. So we're going to say HTTPS. In my case, it's going to be iOS academy.io, just like so. And let's see, I believe there are a few more that we want. So the next one here that's documented is the BA max install size. Now, this is also an integer, and the value that you actually give here will show up in your App Store's app listing page. And the reason Apple has done this is, when the user installs your app, and let's say they barely have any room left on their device, they don't want the user to be in a situation where they're like, oh shoot, I gotta delete this now because I don't have enough space for the, auxiliary assets that need to download. So this is once again an integer. I'm just gonna copy and paste the number we threw up here. And that's all the documented Info.plist updates. Now, the reason I say documented is that there is one more key that goes in here that Apple has either forgotten to add, or I don't know what has happened, but we'll take a look at that momentarily. So in our dropdown up here, let's just select a simulator. We already got a 14 Pro, and let's jump into our view controller. So now in our view controller, we can start by importing the background assets framework, and we are going to create a function here, and we're going to call it Q download. And now two things that I want to call out. One obvious question is, well, how the heck is this different from using URL session, right? Why can't we just use URL session? Because our app is presumably running at this point. And the reason that this is different is that there is a brand new background assets extension as well. And we're going to create that in a moment, but I at least want to start here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the manager, which is a singleton object. I believe it's something like download manager.shared. We are going to set a delegate off of this guy so we can receive events, and I'll conform to this protocol right down here. So we'll say extension on view controller, and this is something like BA download delegate. Let's see if it cooperates. BA download manager delegate. There it is. And there's a bunch of methods in here. So the ones that we're going to do is did finish, of course. That's not what it is. Let's see, finish, something like that, right? Download did finish, there we are. And when it finishes, it gives you a file URL. So we can simply print out file URL dot absolute string. And there's something akin to did start. So let's do start. And actually, instead of me guessing, we can literally jump into here and it'll give us the APIs. So there's did begin and did pause. I'll implement those. They're both optional, but just so folks are aware, they exist. So we'll say began, did pause, and we'll say, whoops, I'm gonna print there. We'll say paused, and there is our minimum delegate implementation. Now, how do we actually queue something to download? Well, we need to create a BA URL download. So we'll say a download here is a BA URL download, and there's a couple of different types of downloads actually, but this is the most common one, so let me just actually limit this video to this. Now you'll see that the constructor takes in a identifier, request, and an application group ID, and it also takes a priority similar to dispatch queues, so we're going to use one without that. And let's talk about these three arguments. So the identifier is anything unique that you can keep track of. It shouldn't be like a UUID that's random, because you can actually queue these downloads, like I mentioned, before your app even launches in the background assets extension. So in other words, for example, when your app installs, you can have iOS kick off your download, and when your app launches, instead of re-kicking off that download, you would say, hey, give me the thing that kicked off the download with the identifier of large file. And you can basically get its state and say, hey, is it still in download state? Is it done? Did it fail? Etc., etc. The next thing is the thing we actually want to download from, and this is going to be a URL that I'll create in a moment. And then the last thing is really important. This is essentially the app group that you need to add to both the extension that we'll create in a moment, as well as your app, so it can share the background manager as well as the path where it is writing assets to. In other words, if your extension downloads something and saves it to disk, you want to make sure that it's being saved and synchronized to your actual app's process as well. So we'll maybe do something like group dot, what did I call this app? We call this cool background assets. So I'll call this cool background assets dot, I don't know, dot container. Let's do that. So this is yelling at me that we don't have a URL, rightfully so. We probably need to create one. So we'll say guardlet URL equals a URL, and I'm going to see if I can remember a URL from the iOS Academy websites. I believe assets, images, logo.png perhaps is a asset. Let me just check this guy really quickly. And even if it's incorrect, you guys will get the points. But I believe this is an asset. Apparently it's not. I lied. Let's try JPEG. Okay, it's a JPEG. So let me just update this to be a JPEG. So there is our URL. So cool, now we're gonna give this a run, and what I expect to happen is I expect our app to crash, and we'll take a look at why in a quick minute. And it'll actually tell you why it's crashing, but it's not documented anywhere, which actually wasted quite a bit of my time the other day. So let's see, this guy crashed, and it's gonna crash on this background download manager.shared. And maybe it won't this time actually, because it knows I'm doing a video and it's gonna cooperate. So let's see, let me just add a background color so we know once this has I actually forgot to call this method. I just realized that's why it's not crashing, but I digress. I will add a background color as well, so we know once the app has launched. And we should expect a crash just like that. Beautiful. So why the heck is this crashing? So if you actually jump to the frame on the left-hand side of why it's crashing, you'll see that the download manager is trying to call a method internal to Apple's code called enforce conforms to requirements. And when we jump in here, you'll see that there is actually a couple issues. So the first issue that we have here is that we provided an app group that doesn't actually exist, and that's why it's not showing the other issues. So let's actually do that. Let's create the app group that we provided the identifier here for, and then we'll take a look at creating the extension, and then we'll see if it still crashes. So I am going to copy that string down there for the app group. We'll come up here, we'll go to signing and capabilities, and we'll hit a new capability and add a app group. And once we do that, we'll just go ahead and hit a plus here. It's going to bring up this pop-up, and I'll just paste in the group that we created and go ahead and hit OK. It'll show up as red, so just give it a minute to get its life together. You'll see updating provisioning here. It doesn't take that long, anywhere between a few seconds to at most a minute. So if it takes super long here, I will cut the video and just edit it together. And you can also hit this refresh button. And if we hit it a few times, you'll see this red will turn to white, like so. Beautiful. Now let's also go ahead and create the new extension. So we're going to go to File, New Target, and we're going to search for background here. You're going to see that there is a background download extension. And we'll call this the cool background extension, just like that. And everything else you can leave as is. And sure, we can enable the new scheme for this. We'll activate it. And just like that, it'll create this for us. You'll also see that the scheme got app groups by default created as well, but it is different from the group that we created. It's using the bundle ID actually. So we'll create another app group for the extension, and it needs to match the one that we added to our main app. Once you add it, you'll see it'll be white by default, just because that's how the extension got configured in the main app when we added it. Let's go ahead and give this a run one more time. Whoops, we want to run the actual app in the simulator, and let's see what the heck happens. So I'll go ahead and give this a run, and we expect to see a crash again. And let's jump back to that enforce. Let's see, give me a moment here. And let's see, we see that we have the same enforce issue here, and let's see what the heck is going on. So usually it gives you a error about what is going on. Basically, there is a manifest that we need to add. So here we can see be a manifest URL. I believe this is the key. Let me just see if it exists elsewhere. But the TLDR here is there's another key that is needed in our Info.plist. And that key is not documented as far as I could tell. Let me switch this to property list. And let's see if we are looking good so far. So we have our initial size here, which is a number, which looks correct, 3,100,000,000. And then here we have our download restrictions, which also looks correct, with our allowance number and our URL. And let's see. So we're going to add one more in here, and we'll see if that resolves it. It should. So let's go down here, and I'll just add it, I guess, right below this. So this is going to be the BA manifest URL. And this is going to be the same URL that we created up here, and we'll paste that down there. Go ahead and give this a run, and let's see if we're still crashing. We'll need to figure out what the heck is going on. So in this case, we have our manager. All right, it's really a shame that Apple's asserting here is not telling you what the heck is specifically the problem. Let's see. So we're going to go into enforce, and Let's see what else we can go ahead and do. We have our keys. Let's double check that we got all our keys. We got our max install size. We got both of these as well. I am going to jump in here and also add a capability for background modes. I believe we do also want that. We're going to enable background fetch. Let's give this a run once more and let's see if it's still crashing. If it is, we got to find out what the heck is going on. So here, if we go to enforce, here we are. Okay, so here is basically the comment that is yelling at us about. So it's saying clients of background assets, the app must contain an array with a key named BA download domain allow list. Okay, so I screwed this up. This one is on me. This one is documented. Essentially, what we want actually in our P list is not this 2 points to an array. For our allow list, it needs to point to an array of strings. So if we come back here and we go to our, let's see, BA domain allow list, let's find it. I think it's up here. Here it is. This is a key pointing to a string, and what we want this to point to is actually an array, and this array is going to contain a bunch of strings. So let me create an array from this, and I realized I could have copy and pasted that, but we'll toss a string here, and we will paste in there. Let me just switch to property list for the view to make sure it is all good to go. And let's see. All right, so we have one thing in here. Give this a run, and we hopefully should not be crashing. All right, there we go, progress. So it's kind of a shame that Apple's error reporting doesn't actually tell you in the console what's wrong, and you have to, scavenge through assembly, but I digress. So cool, so this is how you actually create a download. Now, how do we queue something to be downloaded? So the first thing we want to understand is that because this manager is shared across the extension that could be running in the background and your app, there's an API where you can say, hey, manager, give me exclusive control. In other words, synchronize that I have the rights to use you at the moment, and it's not the extension. So here we're going to get a Boolean, and we're also going to get an error. So we're going to say guard that we have control, and that the error is nil. And once we're in here, we can now start using this manager and playing around with it. So we're going to do a do catch statement, and we're going to say, hey, try manager. And we can go ahead and say start a foreground download, or we can say, I believe it's schedule a download, and this is by default in the background. Now, a BA download is the base class, so we can pass in the URL download that we defined right up here. And this is going to schedule it to be done in the background. Now, because our app is running here, we're in a view controller, it makes sense to do a foreground download, right? If our download hasn't completed from the extension, we don't just want to wait for that. We just want to start a higher priority task, assuming, that download is not almost done. And in the error case, I'm just going to print out the error, or a string describing the error, I should say. And that's essentially how you go ahead and set these up. So one other caveat is that this is a huge pain to test on the simulator because it is still being worked on Apple's side. So testing on a device actually works on the simulator, doesn't work 90% of the time in my own testing. Now let's jump to the extension that we created just to take a quick peek in there before we wrap up here. So the extension already gives you a download handler, which is where you'll do the bulk of your work, and then it gives you the extension's configuration itself. Nothing needs to go into the plist for the extension. You only need to work inside of here. So one nice thing inside of here is that Apple has done a pretty good job of documenting what all this stuff is. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that the group that it added in here for the app groups does not match the one that we used since we created our own. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that your group actually matches. So we'll jump here, and I'm just going to replace this, and it gives you a nice blurb about what it's doing with the group and whatnot. Here it creates a set of downloads, and the downloads to schedule, of course, you would actually create a download and append it to that. And you can see that it actually is doing that here. So here would be some unique asset URL or identifier, I should say. Here's your URL and here's your app group ID. Very similar to what we did in the view controller. The difference is that this extension will be kicked off whenever your app either updates or whenever your app is initially downloaded. The other thing I'll mention is that this gets downloaded to the disk, so you should also add some code to clean up the file on disk via File Manager. I've got a dedicated video on using File Manager. Now, the last thing I'll touch on here is that you'll see all these, delegate-esque methods of download filled with error, download finished with file URL, very similar to what we implemented over in the main app. And then you also have extension will terminate. So in other words, you can clean up, any in progress downloads. You can add any logging that you need to, but it's fairly cut and dry in terms of what's in here. It's really cool that Apple's thinking about the need of these larger apps that these developers are putting out. And if you need to update an image, historically, if you do it the right way, you're supposed to go and actually update your app via the App Store, even though a lot of apps kind of circumvent that and have their own download things built out with a CDN or other type of cloud service. So that is all I have got for you guys today. A little bit rambly video since the plist decided to not cooperate, but this is Background Assets. Let me know if you've used it in the comments down below. Drop a like if you haven't done so already. Subscribe for more iOS content. Follow on Twitter, Instagram, connect on LinkedIn, all the socials. Love hearing from you guys. Thanks again for watching. I will catch you on the next one.